I'm Dilara Salahova, and this is the Sustain, Change, and Grow podcast, your source of knowledge and inspiration for sustainable habits. Do you remember last summer how burning hot it was? Passing sleepless nights and then feeling tired and unproductive next day? You know, it was the hottest summer on record in Europe and China, and the second hottest in North America and Asia. The consequences were dire in Europe and across the world. In Europe, the 2022 drought appeared to be the worst since at least 500 years. Harvests were low, many forests were burning. Do you remember how river levels were low? Ships were not even allowed to pass. Trains couldn't travel because railroads were banned. And more than 15,000 people died as a direct result of heat waves. What shocks me the most is that just in 15 years, this intense heat summer of 2022 will become an average summer in Europe. In less developed countries, the situation was even worse. Let's take Pakistan as an example. It saw catastrophic monsoon flooding. Many places got rainfall worse of several years just in 1 month, and total losses amounted to 1/4 of the budget of the entire Pakistan in 2021. And what are the losses that we should expect in the future? Can we get prepared for this? What governments can do, and what are they already doing? Today, I am talking to Sahil Shah. I hope he can answer to my questions. Sahil is a co-founder of Tipping Frontier. He specializes in assessing financial losses from climate disasters. He also evaluates government policies and investments needed to improve resilience of countries and their financial systems. Sahil, a warm welcome to the Sustain, Change, and Grow podcast, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I look forward to it too.
So you're based in London, and this summer in London, in the UK, in Europe, was extremely hot, like really record hot. Can you measure the financial impact of such weather phenomenon, of the heat, of the drought, etc.?
That's a pretty good question. And the answer is always that you can measure it, and you can measure it in a large number of ways. It's how you measure it. So often what's done in previous instances is what's called counterfactual analysis. When, let's say, if you have a 2 or 3 week heat wave, then that's compared with previous years, controlling for other factors that might have changed. So that's a method that's often used to get an overall macro number for the financial impact. However, that doesn't explain some of the more micro phenomenon that can change on a year-by-year basis, and some of the stresses. Like, for example, some of the health disruption and impacts that we saw as a result of this summer's heat wave would have been heavily exacerbated by pre-existing struggles in the NHS due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The same goes for some of the education disruption that had pre-existing disruption from the pandemic as well. And I think the important part when you are measuring the impact of a lot of these phenomena is that the impacts are not linear. So a heat wave that would be 4 degrees above baseline is not double the impact of one which is 2 degrees above baseline, because of critical tipping points that you have. For example, there are temperatures upon which electrical grid failure becomes substantively more likely. So you do have various different techniques in which you're able to measure the short-term financial impact of these phenomenon, but also of interest to measure is the long-term impacts. And those can be slightly trickier because that can include the cost of adaptation. So that could include aspects like retrofitting buildings with more efficient HVAC systems and the more general installation of air conditioning. It could be changing pathways around and timelines around farming practices, when you might see shifts in planting and harvesting dates, or you potentially might see shifts in working hours, which has further knock-on effects. So you can almost certainly measure the impact of these phenomena. The hard part is trying to understand what is due to the heat wave itself, and how do you articulate and, I guess, understand how these impacts change depending upon the different steps that individuals, companies, and governments take.
Right. Well, and now it's even also significantly impacted by the war, right? So like there are so many factors going on around that will affect the counterfactual of measuring the effect of this year relatively to the effect of the last year. But in this case, so what is your approach? How do you measure? Is it still you measure the difference between the 2 years, and then you what actually you do? How do you disentangle the other factors?
Sure. So we take a systems approach, and we do this through a few different lenses. So the first thing that we do is we attempt to exhaustively list the various different qualitative impacts that the heat wave would take. And then we look at proxy variables. So for example, there are impacts of the of heat on human health. So one of the things that we're able to do is we're able to access numbers of patients going to A&E in the UK, for example, accident and emergency. And we are able to use previous data that looks at, I guess, the impacts of heat wave on nutrition and productivity, and extrapolate what the likely long-term productivity impacts of that would be. When it goes to business interruption, we're able to look at numbers on transport networks and how those change. For example, if the number of people on trains are 50% of what they are usually, and we're able to use proxy metrics from the past from how those have impacted different impacts of GDP. So really, we take a infrastructure a critical system by critical system approach, and look at some of the intersections between systems. So another example of that is with the drought, where we would look at water availability and how that affects the chemical industry as an input. And then from that, we could look at a mixture of historical and real-time data that would show changes in production of critical chemicals. So we take a much more granular approach when we are attempting to measure these phenomena.
Okay, so basically you really go sector by sector. So you look at the health, you look at the transportation and other. And so you compare not only to the previous year, you compare also, like, let's say to the previous year, but also to much longer. So like this, you have some smoothing, right, of the effect over time. And maybe some years were affected by certain other disasters or events, but you don't account it because you kind of average over the longer term performance of this sector, of the measured variable. Is that a good summary?
That's sometimes the case. We still do have a focus on looking at what the short-term impact is, so what that basically GDP loss is of the financial impact, but then we also do the long-term changes as well. So I know we'll come on to it later, but like climate change and increased uncertainty in weather can lead to a reduction in investment, because investors dislike the uncertainty. So we do both the immediate term and the longer term.
Mm-hmm. So for the moment, we have been talking about the heat waves and the potential droughts related to the heat waves. But what are the other disasters that Europe or UK is facing that are related to the climate change?
So the other two most significant ones for the UK, as well as drought and heat waves, would be flooding and storms, both pluvial and fluvial flooding, and also storms affecting both the marine environment, but then also inland. When it comes to the humanitarian impacts, generally the heat waves do have the highest impact. But if you look at the financial impacts and the impacts on assets, then flooding and storms do tend to have a larger impact. And there are a fairly wide variety of different, I guess, adaptive mechanisms that are being made in place. So for example, with flooding, you're able to put flood barriers in place, both artificial flood barriers, and you're able to do things like planting mangrove forests. So one of the things that we are able to do is we're able to model for a given flood or for a given storm, based upon sort of storm surge and other factors, like what the impact would be on assets in the local area where it would hit, both with and without the adaptation. So if you don't have the flood barrier, what would the impact be in terms of the rise in the water level versus if you didn't? And then based upon historical data and some of the model systems, we are able to determine what that would then lead to in terms of predicted disruption and predicted losses. When it comes to some of the policy interventions as opposed to the actual like technical resilience investments, that becomes slightly more challenging to do on a micro scale. What you are able to do on a more macro scale when you have hazards that affect like larger parts of Europe is you're able to compare and contrast policies in different countries, and you are effectively able to use instrumental variables through that as a way to estimate how different policies change the human or financial impact. So an example would be that there was a large sort of health communications policy during the heat wave here about reminding people to drink water, and it was more done in urban environments in the UK, was seen more prevalently than in rural environments. And if you're able to disentangle the heat elements in urban versus rural environments and look at the adaptive measures, you're able to develop proxy measures that would show how, for example, like health communications can change adaptive behaviors that in turn show that in turn change the total impacts to human health and GDP.
Mm-hmm. Well, so essentially you use some sort of econometric analysis.
Amongst other techniques, but yes, we do use econometric analyses. And I think the other hazard that I would flag, because often when we look at climate change, we focus on the direct hazards associated with climate change. Whereas if you look at predicted temperature changes, that also changes the profiles of several emergent infectious diseases. So for example, we do have mosquitoes in large parts of Europe, but at 18 degrees, they're unable to carry several different viruses. Whereas as that increases over time, it is deemed likely by epidemiologists that diseases like dengue, West Nile, and chikungunya will spread to the European continent. And the impact of these new emergent infectious diseases are highly uncertain. So the other part that we look at, as well as conflict and climate change, is also pandemics, with a particular interest at the intersection between climate change and pandemics.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, there are also other types of effects due to the climate change that we are not yet even facing, right? So like most people know about the droughts, heat waves, floods, but you're also talking that there will be like really completely changing environment, which will bring also new diseases. The spread of the diseases may be also much faster.
Yes.
And actually, there are also, so for example, about the heat waves. So some scientists say that when the temperature degree increases, people have more difficulty to sleep. And so heat waves will have an effect on people's sleep and therefore on their productivity, potentially on their humor, and there will be more conflicts, etc. Is it something that you could potentially model as well?
Yeah, so the main way in which we look at the impact of extreme heat on productivity is primarily focusing on workers that would have environments that would be impacted. So if you look at office workers, for example, that work in air-conditioned buildings, they're unlikely to have a material impact. But if you look at outdoor industries like agriculture or even construction, potentially mining, these are outdoor environments in which if it's too hot for, say, 4 or 5 hours of the day, then workers might only be able to work a certain number of hours in the early morning and the late evening, and that will impact what the associated output would be. So that's definitely something that we do look at. In terms of the other part of your question, we do look at conflict as well, but less from the human psychology aspect and slightly more from the resource shortage aspect. So it's determined that in the 21st century, the most likely causes of conflict will be sort of food, water, and energy shortages driven by the climate crisis. And especially when you look at water shortages, it's arguably the case that one of the main reasons that underlie the India-China skirmishes are due to the large freshwater resource that basically sits across the border of the two countries. So it's definitely something that we're modeling as a factor that makes conflict more likely. However, it's very difficult to actually predict exactly when conflict will occur and even what the nature of conflict will be. But there is an ability to predict increasing likelihood of conflict due to increased tensions.
Mm-hmm. And so, according to your estimations, like how much money, how many investments do we need in Europe, or maybe more specifically in the UK, to address these issues and to make the system more resilient? Would you have any number?
It's very hard to give a single number, and I'll explain why it's hard to give a number in that you're able to build resilience to like particular hazards for particular regions. However, once you start to look at systems more broadly, the UK, for example, imports half of its food. So even if you're able to build resilience to the UK food production system and you're able to bolster it, that wouldn't necessarily cater for the half that's currently imported. And like obviously when you're looking at de-risking, it's not just on production, but it's supply chain and trade, which is international in nature. So when you start to look at these systems more holistically, it's very difficult to build sort of a country level by country level resilience need rather than taking a more systems level approach. And then it also depends upon what you're building resilience to. So you might be able to build resilience to droughts, for example, and floods and heat waves for the next 10 years. But one of your trade-offs with this could be through trying to mitigate falling nutrient levels, and that may lead to further issues down the road when it comes to soil quality, which would then need to be reversed in the future. There are other aspects that aren't necessarily solved solely through financial interventions as well. So going back to COVID-19, one of the major issues we had in the UK is the UK normally had seasonal workers that act as fruit pickers and more generally as agricultural laborers. But in the summer of 2020, it was very difficult for these people to move over and to work safely. So that had a substantive impact on the supply chain itself. So it's hard to give exact numbers at this point in time because a lot of the modeling and work is being done. But as soon as I have an update on that, I shall ensure that I pass that on to you.
Mm-hmm. So no numbers.
Some numbers. I don't have the number for your particular question.
Maybe let me rephrase it a little bit, the question. So for the transition, there are many institutions which suggest the numbers that we need to transition the economy to a low carbon economy. And most of these estimates, they lie from like 2 to 5, but certainly less than 10% of the GDP. And it doesn't matter if it's at the country level or it's at the global, the world level. So this is the mitigation part. And for the adaptation, so that's the building the resilience. Is it the comparable numbers? Is it something that we need more? Is something that what we're doing to mitigate the climate change will help also to the adaptation, or it's like completely different set of investments that we need to make? Maybe you can qualitatively discuss this.
It's a slightly different approach and a different need in that the nature of climate adaptation in itself is much more localized than mitigation, especially if you look at large industries like that produce the majority of emissions, like for example, the construction industry, the agriculture industry. When it comes to local adaptation, for example, you might be looking at a flood-prone area of the northwest in the UK. And for that, you would need to map out in more detail I guess the pre-existing assets that are vulnerable, the cost of retrofitting them, and what the ex-ante and ex-post impact would be. When it comes to most of the modeling that we have done, we do have an emerging market focus of a tipping frontier, so we haven't modeled the UK and Europe in a great amount of detail. But if we're using similar projections to those that we have in countries like Indonesia and Brazil, the cost of adaptation as opposed to mitigation would be an order of magnitude higher. However, due to the fact that the UK and Europe is generally less climate vulnerable than a country like Indonesia is, and the fact that the mitigation cost is so much larger, I would expect that the adaptation cost would be more in line with the mitigation cost. However, it remains to be the case that this is rarely sort of a top-down nationalized number, and often ends up being much more localized in understanding how particular hazard affects particular communities and what's needed at a community level set of resilience.
Mm-hmm. So, and then should the adaptation measures be employed at the community level, or is it more the government, the general government problem?
There are impacts at various levels. So, for example, you kind of a heat wave that affects the country as a whole, and you have impacts that would affect the whole country. So, for example, when it comes to the electrical grid and the electrical grid resilience, that's something that would affect the country as a whole, and is something that central government should be responsible for. However, if you're looking at the impact of human health within a particular region, that might be served by a particular healthcare trust, and they would be best placed to be able to manage the impacts on healthcare services, healthcare communication to local residents, and have a good enough understanding of where there are sort of local outdoor workers and where they're likely to be stressors and vulnerable people, such as elderly and children, in order to be able to predict what increases might be, for example, in hospital admissions, and what those costs would be. So in short, where there are nationwide effects, then I think it should be central government. Where the effects are differentiated much more locally, then the greater the amount of devolution, the more accurate the potential response.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let us move to the food security question. So what is you actually, for Europe, you somehow mentioned that Europe exports, and the UK in particular, a lot of food from abroad. So it depends on the chains, in food production outside of Europe. So, but can you some sort of describe the situation with the food security a little bit more for Europe, and then we will move to the low-income country, like African countries, and also emerging countries.
Sure. So yes, the UK especially does import a large proportion of its food currently. When it comes to the food security situation in Europe, it's primarily a price and affordability issue at the moment, as opposed to availability. There is more than enough food in the UK and across most of Western Europe. The issue at the moment is on consumer affordability, especially when it comes to healthy diets. And the main drivers of that are predominantly the drivers of the cost of food production. So food, for example, I guess at least food produced in Europe is quite fertilizer intensive, and the largest input into fertilizer is natural gas. So when we're looking at the food price inflation and food security issues across Europe, that is predominantly at this point in time an impact from the energy price crisis. However, it also has impacts relating back to sort of upstream supply chains. So a large amount of fertilizer does come from Russia and Belarus, as well as from China. And due to COVID-19 related issues in China, where they have had restrictions in exporting fertilizer, and a mixture of sanctions and restrictions on fertilizer from Russia and Belarus, that has led to an increase in the food price and is a major aspect of the global food crisis that we see today, but more specifically, the main impact that we see in Europe. Adding to that, there is a certain amount of food that is normally imported from Ukraine, and the reduction in imports from Ukraine across global markets has substantively increased international prices. However, Europe is significantly more insulated from that than the developing world. as the actual core grain wholesale price is a much smaller proportion of the overall retail price than rural areas in developing countries such as India.
And so, what is the situation in the emerging and low-income countries? How different the problems are?
So the problems there are substantively different, and they've changed a lot over time. I think the UN's FAO often say, well, more recently, that over 1 in 10 people go to bed hungry, and actually 205 million people are what they call food insecure. So they're either in something called IPC3 or IPC4 or 5. So they are heavily food insecure, or they are leading into famine. What this means and how this has changed really is an increase of roughly 30 million in the last year between 2021 and 22. And if I remember correctly, it's an increase of more than 50 million when you are looking at before the pandemic. I guess in terms of the situation of food security and those issues in many of these countries is that they are also importers of grain from countries like Ukraine and Russia. However, because there has been disruption, wealthier European countries are still able to afford to import that food. However, it's much harder for low-income countries to do so, especially when there is pre-existing debt stresses, as has been the case across the developing world due to COVID-19. So there, I guess other stresses as well are worth.
Sorry, so in short, it's the same price and affordability, right? So it's the same problem. It's just that the developed countries, they still can afford it, but the low-income countries, they cannot anymore.
That's a large part of it, yes.
Because indeed, so the statistics show that as a humanity, we produce more food than people need. So it's the question of the distribution of the food and the availability in different regions. Because you're also an expert working with the World Bank's Famine Action Mechanism. So what are really the problems and the bottlenecks? How can we resolve it? So, like, what are the problems and what are the potential solutions? So, yes. And how much money we needed. So, because it's really puzzling. We have a lot of food, and still some people don't get even the basic needs covered.
That's a really good question. So I have had the privilege before. I have had the privilege of feeding into the Famine Action Mechanism Technical Working Group. And I guess in terms of breaking it down, it's sort of between the short term and the long term. So the short term is about sort of financing the urgent humanitarian need. And the World Food Programme tend to break it down in terms of their emergency crisis appeals. So recently they've been asking for it was sort of $6 billion, which I think has slightly increased more recently. And there was actually a sort of a famous Twitter exchange between them and Elon Musk about that being the amount that could be used to solve world hunger. However, that's sort of really around alleviating humanitarian crises for a number of months. The broader question is on food system transformation, which, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been costed globally. I have had the privilege of being able to input into Bangladesh's climate adaptation plan, their Majim plan, and this does tend to be costed more on a national level. However, at a singular country level, in order to be able to transform their food system, often the costs go into billions because of, I guess, pre-existing issues and market structures that actually make food system transformation very challenging. So, for example, across much of sub-Saharan Africa, you have issues where you have a very large number of smallholder farmers that have very small amounts of land. And that means because these parts of land are so small that they're unable to invest into technology around sort of mechanization and improving yields because the fixed cost of the technology is too high for it to be worth the amount of land that they have. So land consolidation, for example, is something that could potentially increase yields, but would have a large number of social impacts that would need to be considered. And another one that sort of ties into this quite well is the inability for a lot of smallholder farmers in the developing world to actually access finance. And that has a whole host of various different historic reasons. but one of the more salient ones is effectively a lack of property rights, where many farmers don't actually own or have the title deeds for the land upon which they farm, because it's often been a sort of community level agreement for a number of generations. And without actually having these title deeds, lenders are often unwilling to lend to these farmers because they're basically don't have collateral upon which those loans can be made. So there are a number of structural issues of which they have been partially assessed in sort of how much money is needed. However, in addressing some of the associated social issues, clear solutions for them do not yet exist, not holistically.
So it's not only about investments, it's also about the structural reforms in each country, and the situations are different and vary from one country to another. So like in a way, there is not the one for all solution. There is a need to go into each country and look how it works there, what are the problems and the bottlenecks, and how it can be addressed.
Yes, of course, there are technical solutions that are really promising across a number of different countries. For example, if you look at gene editing and genetic modification for seeds, especially for being able to provide drought tolerant, extreme heat tolerant, resistant seeds, for example, and especially for how those inform sort of core crops like wheat and maize that produce a large proportion of the world's calories. These are sort of highly promising solutions that could be trialed and scaled in a lot of countries. However, the actual sort of process of working with local stakeholders and local regulations in each country does differ quite significantly. So often the technologies are similar, if not the same, but the process of actually scaling them can be quite different.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the GMO, genetically modified objects, because on the one hand, they have certain qualities like heat resistant or cold resistant or whatever. But on the other hand, they don't reproduce seeds. So then farmers, they are dependent on the big corporations to get the seeds every year, and they cannot be autosufficient. Isn't it even a bigger problem?
That's definitely a problem, and that does need to be addressed, and there are different ways in which this can be addressed. So, for example, you can have contracts between these companies and national governments, and it can be farmers working with national or regional governments, or you could have agreements between these companies and, for example, CSOs or NGOs. However, what I would add is that quite a lot of, I guess, fundamental agricultural research isn't always done by large agricultural companies. For example, the CGIAR centers across the world do quite a lot of research, the 15 centers, into the role of technologies such as gene editing and genetic modification. Their remit sits much more around a sort of global public good and good for farmers, as well as substantive amounts of research that's done at the nation state level as well. So the European Commission funds some work on this, and the US government do as well. So there are options in which this can be structured in ways that are more beneficial for farmers. But I think it's critical that sort of both farmers and consumers, well, citizens, are taken into account when it comes to how these programs are structured, so you aren't creating farmer dependency and facilitating monopolies and market structures that don't benefit the country as a whole. But at the same time, you are ensuring that there is the ability to have the adoption of disruptive technologies as far as they can benefit the resilience of the food system.
And do you think that we can significant progress as long as 4 companies, they known as A, B, C, D, so the ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and the Louis Dreyfus, are like essentially 4 companies which are responsible for 90% of all the grain production, distribution, etc. So like there is a huge concentration of power in just 4 companies. And can we really solve the problem given the situation?
It's a good question. I think that 90% number that is used, if I remember correctly, isn't necessarily a global number. So if you look at countries such as China as well, and you incorporate them, then that number is slightly lower. However, like the situation around like oligopoly of production it's still an issue when it comes to power structures. However, like if we're focused on the developing world and the food security issues there, it's less about the power structures and it's often more about what a lot of the local smallholder farmers are able to do there. So yes, there are issues in being able to get agricultural inputs, whether that's tractors or seeds or fertilizers. These are controlled by a small number of companies, and often there are issues around pricing being too high. So in the short term, that can often be solved through subsidies. There's often criticism about subsidies in agriculture in the developing world. However, a lot of this criticism is often from the EU and the US that often have large agricultural subsidies themselves. So I think in the short run, agricultural subsidies can be a sticking plaster that can sort of help farmers invest in just develop some of these technologies when it comes to actually being able to both increase production and resilience, both resilience of their crop, but also their own financial resilience through the purchase of insurance and other social safety nets. Longer term, because the cost associated with actually being able to develop a lot of these technologies, I had the privilege of visiting Bayer and their agricultural research center just before COVID hit to learn a little bit more about their R&D process and actually the cost of bringing some of these crops to market. So just because of the, I guess, the natural market structure that would create, I think the answer is much more about regulation than it is necessarily about breaking up companies and ensuring that when these technologies are provided, they are provided at a fair price in a fair way, and that these market structures don't lead to above market prices. So I think a regulatory environment that was consistent across a large number of countries, but also fair, would have large enough benefits at the farmer and citizen level. But crucially, if it were to be adopted at a larger level, say a Pan-African Union level, then the regulatory cost wouldn't be too high for some of the larger agricultural companies as well. So you would be able to find a fine balance between making sure that we still have these investments in technologies, but we do have these equity and distribution and justice concerns answered as well.
Are there financial instruments or solutions how we could scale up investments going into resolving these issues in the low-income countries, so emerging countries?
That's a really good question. And the answer is yes. We often have the solutions available and we're able to develop the products. However, the issue can be data. So one of the products that I've actually been working on has been a catastrophe bond, or sort of a macro level insurance product in the event of future locust outbreaks. So recently, sort of roughly between sort of 2019 and 2021, we had the worst locust outbreak across the Horn of Africa in the last 75 years. And estimates in terms of the crop damage range to sort of high single-digit billions. And the way that a product like this would work is that it would fund monitoring, and monitoring could potentially be done by drones. And in the event of an early stage of a locust outbreak, it would fund a control operation where locusts are sprayed with pesticides. Because if they're left unchecked, they're very similar to infectious diseases and they grow exponentially. So this is an example of a product that could be used. However, more broadly, there are different ways in which new product structures can be explored. One of these would be looking at the role of guarantors. So one of the main associated concerns is with credit risk, but having guarantors from development finance can be a way in which to leverage private capital. And I recently had the privilege to attend the African Green Revolution Forum in Kigali in early September. And when it came to leveraging development finance, sort of the key focus here is given sort of limited development finance. especially agribusiness development finance. It's how can we leverage as many dollars from the private sector as we can. So, for example, it could be taking on some of the riskier debt on the public sector side to de-risk it on the private sector side. Structuring projects is another aspect that can be looked at. So where corruption is an issue, there are ways in which this could be circumvented. So if you're looking at insurance, you could use parametric insurance on the blockchain, which would mean that payouts would go directly to farmers in the event of a given catastrophe, rather than having to go through a much lengthier chain. And if you look at more innovative use of mobile money as well, which tends to be significantly more direct, these are various different ways in which corruption can be circumvented as well, as that tends to be one of the major issues in actually attracting foreign direct investment for agri-resilience in the developing world.
What is about the political instability? Because this is one of the risks that is also often cited.
Yeah, where there are like large amounts of political instability, it can be very difficult to attract private capital. It's often one that is quite challenging to solve. However, we still have seen quite large agri investments. So if we look at the Democratic Republic of Congo as an example, although there has been a huge amount of political instability in recent years, we have seen a number of agri investments, predominantly from the Chinese government in recent years. So where there are strategic benefits, especially when it comes to trade and growth, I think having bilateral and multilateral country involvement can help when it comes to facilitating investments. Otherwise, it's often at a project level, and it's understanding how you're able to de-risk political risk at a project level. So when you are in fragile and conflict zones, that's often very challenging, and there's not much you can do to de-risk it. However, sometimes there's political instability without conflict, and in those instances, it's about effectively minimizing some of the associated supply chain risk and trying to have as short a supply chain as possible in effectively being able to minimize that political risk.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're talking about private money, who are the investors that you have in mind? Is it the more traditional investors like banks, via bank loans, so investment funds or insurance companies? Or are you thinking about really private equity and hedge funds and the investors who are ready to take more risk?
I think both sets of actors do need to be looked at. I think when it comes to taking some of the riskier bets, we have seen the role of private equity. If you take sub-Saharan, if you take Africa as an example, that's definitely been the case in both South Africa and Kenya, if you look at their agricultural industries. However, when it comes to the scale of the finance that's needed, we really do need to involve the banks, the insurance companies, the large asset owners, the pension funds, life insurers, for example, that do need to be incorporated into this. And it's about understanding the risk appetite of these different financial institutions to match them with the most appropriate investments for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very, very brief question about your company, for the seaweed. So you're promoting the seaweed as one of the solutions to the food security. So how will it help to solve the issue? Because also seaweed is essentially, well, it grows in the sea and many countries don't have access to the sea. So that's what really is your proposal and how it helps?
Sure, I will briefly describe the question, briefly describe the company, and then I'll answer the question in more depth. So yes, I have a company that has a novel technology that uses a different type of material to grow seaweed at high yields, and a different type of engineering setup that enables the mechanization of both the seeding and the harvesting, highly reducing how labor intensive it is, so reducing the cost of production. In terms of resolving the food security problem, there are various ways and various methods. So if we're producing large amounts of seaweed offshore, seaweed can actually be used in a number of different ways. So yes, it can be used for human feed, but it can also be used as an element of livestock feed and for fish feed. So it can replace uses such as soy, which then can be used as human feed. Seaweed is often repurposed fertilizer, and where fertilizer is prohibitively expensive or fertilizer is unavailable, seaweed can be used. And crucially, like seaweed, when it's grown, often provides a habitat for juvenile fish and improves the quality of the local marine body. And over the long run, sort of large seaweed farms, and if you look at natural kelp forests, they have substantive benefits on local fish stocks. So there are large benefits for both the number and the size of the fish that local fishermen are able to catch. So although it is as a solution, it's one that really can only be undertaken by countries with the coastline. It can improve both food security within country, but then it can also provide export opportunities. So if you take a country like Tanzania that could grow seaweed, it would provide export opportunities for them to export fertilizer, for example, or seaweed-based fertilizer across the African continent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So now let's really talk about you. So what really motivates you to work on this topic?
So my main motivation on this is just the scale and the urgency of the issue. Often the numbers that we're speaking about are like unfathomable or like unimaginable, like just the sheer volume to think about the like hundreds of millions of people that are food insecure, or the predicted billions of people that will be affected by climate change. And I genuinely believe that the greatest travesty is not the actions taken by the few that further the issues, but it's the silent majority that stand by and enable it. And that I think there is a moral responsibility for our generation to do as much as we can in order to, I guess, preserve the health of the planet for future generations.
And as an individual, are you concerned by your own carbon footprint? And if so, do you change something in your own lifestyle?
I am. I do what I can. I must admit, I don't have the lowest of carbon footprint because of a lot of my work-related travel, but I do take whatever actions I can. So I am predominantly vegan, and the global food system does produce a substantial proportion of global emissions. And I guess the other actions that I take are a number of donations. So I donate both to the Clean Air Task Force and to Cool Earth, that are very cost effective when it comes to the tons of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere per dollar spent.
Okay. And so another interesting question about you is that you really have an entrepreneurial spirit. So you have compounded a couple of companies. And so what drives like your decision to start companies? Where does your entrepreneurial spirit come from?
So there are sort of two different questions in here. So like, I guess, where's the like entrepreneurial spirit come from, and then what drove the decision for these particular companies? So I'll answer them separately. In terms of this entrepreneurial spirit, I guess it comes like imbued from my family and my community. I come from both of my parents were entrepreneurs. Many of my uncles and aunts were entrepreneurs. My grandfathers were. I come from a community that well, forcibly in British East Africa, had no choice but to be sort of small business owners. And the case also here, after my parents emigrated to the UK in the early 1970s. So I have always sort of grown up also sort of being involved within family businesses. And it was just preeminent in my psyche that it's the type of thing that I would be doing as I grow older. And in terms of the particular companies that I have co-founded, it really goes back to scale and impact. There's an Australian climate scientist called Tim Flannery that said that if you use 9% of the world's ocean to grow seaweed, you produce enough food to feed the world. You would meet global energy demand, and you would absorb total global carbon dioxide emissions. And then when it comes to tipping frontier, a huge amount of work is done when it comes to attempting to shift policy and building resilience for sort of climate change, conflict, and pandemics. However, there's very little work that's actually done in attempting to work with the financial sector in order to help them sort of better incentivize and actually make those resilience investments. And when you compare sort of mitigation that has alliances like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, that has I think over sort of $150 billion under management, and compare that to the kind of money that's actually going into adaptation, the numbers are paltry, as was said in the recent climate adaptation summit. So it's a real mixture of how neglected this is and the potential impact in being able to influence sort of large swathes of capital.
Mm-hmm. And what are the main challenges that you are facing as an entrepreneur?
So there are different challenges associated with different businesses. So when it comes to the seaweed business, unfortunately, we've been stuck in a regulatory process in the UK for over 4.5 years in order to get permits to be able to grow seaweed offshore. And the case is the same for a lot of Western Europe as well. And often for climate entrepreneurs, marine entrepreneurs, we found that regulatory barriers can be a real issue in being able to get things off the ground to test and try new things. And when it comes to tipping frontier, I guess the main challenge there is actually some of the technical and system complexity when it comes to modeling the systems and the system interlinkages and the data gaps that we do have in order to be able to make more accurate recommendations.
Okay. And so the last question that I ask every guest, what are your two most inspiring books?
Oh, it's very hard to choose just two, but I'll do my best. So the first book I actually alluded to, which is a book called Atmosphere of Hope by an Australian climate scientist called Tim Flannery. That's a book that I read roughly a decade ago now, actually, that sort of educated me on the role that seaweed could play in climate change and food security and bioenergy. And I found it incredible. He's written more recent books to elaborate on this. The other book is actually The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama, as I think I guess the importance of both looking inwards as well as looking outwards is critical to ensure that our lives and our impacts are sustainable for ourselves in the long run.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sahil. I think that was super informative and very, very interesting. So, and I wish you all the best with all your projects. And I hope your efforts will help to reduce both the famine in the world, but also prepare the world to the climate disasters that will happen, because I think we're not moving fast enough to mitigate our impact. So all the best.
Thank you
Thank you
so
very much. Bye-bye.
much. Bye.